And welcome back to the Obviously Outdoorsman podcast. It's another day, it's another First Light talk, and today's is number 38 of why do bucks actually shed? And many of you listening have probably shed hunted at one point or another, and whether you've actually found sheds or not, you've probably asked the question of why do their antlers actually fall off? And if you learn why and what makes them fall off, can you actually look for cues that let us know when they are about to shed? In this podcast, I'm going to explain why bucks actually shed and the variables that affect each deer individually that causes each buck to shed at different times of the year. So stick around to see if learning why they shed will help you know when they are going to shed. And if you guys are new to the Obviously Outdoorsman podcast, please hit the subscribe button. Please like this video if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're watching this on any audio platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please just share this video, like the video, and just share it with anyone you think that needs to hear this podcast or needs to hear this knowledge, or you think that someone may be interested in it. We're just trying to teach as many people as we could possibly teach and help them out as hunters and fishermen, and we would just love to grow this hunting community. And whether you are a hunter or a non-hunter, we would love for you to follow our podcast, because we do try not to just talk about hunting or fishing topics. We try and keep it broad, but I know sometimes we do go broad and deep into these podcasts. But back to why do bucks actually shed? So first things first, and this is a common mistake by hunters and shed hunters, and I've done it as well. But deer have antlers, not horns. They are not the same thing. Horns are a two-part structure found on animals like sheep and antelope, and they're members of the bovine family, while antlers are actually an extension of the animal's skull. Antlers are found on deer like whitetail, mule deer, elk, and moose, and more. And they are members of the Cervidae family, which is simply just the deer family. And I just had to clear that one up for the people using the wrong terminology. And two more terms you should know while we're on the aspect of terminology: the pedicle and the osteoclast. All right, the pedicle is where antlers actually grow from and connect to the skull. So when you see a shedded buck, those two giant holes on their foreheads, they are their pedicles. When they freshly shed, you will see fresh blood on their pedicles. And once they've been shedded for a few days, their pedicle will turn black once that blood dries up. Now an osteoclast, all right? It's essentially the reason bucks' antlers fall off. After the rut, when bucks' testosterone levels drop, a new bone cell, which is the osteoclast, will actually start removing the existing bone tissue between the pedicle and the base of the antler until it eventually falls off. Now, what sparks the process of bucks actually shedding is the drop in testosterone they have after the rut. But there are a few main variables that affect the timing of when a specific deer sheds, and why the timing of these bucks will shed early, like in December, and why some bucks can hold into April. Typically, bucks shed somewhere between late January and mid-March, but the variables that affect this are their nutrition, their stress levels, the region they live in, and injuries. And that's just the main variables. There's another really big variable, which is a late or prolonged rut. And we're going to touch on each of these variables and basically just deep dive on teaching you why each one will affect them in different ways. But they all really tie into the stress factor. So let's start with the region. Depending on where you are in the country, bucks will shed at different times of the year. At the very north, the deer will shed earlier than the middle states throughout the country. Northern states will generally shed in or around January. Mid states, while they will generally shed in like February to March, and that is like the typical shed season for many people. Southern states will shed generally in March and April. And of course, there are outliers in each situation. Some may drop in December, some may hold till late April. It all depends on each buck. And let's touch on the stress factor. A severe winter or predation can be a huge impact on deer. If they have a real hard time finding food for days or weeks at a time, or if predators like coyotes or wolves are constantly pushing deer trying to get a meal, obviously a combo of these will have deer extremely stressed out. And depending on how high or low the stress levels will be, that will depend if they will drop early or if they will drop at a typical time of year. And the next factor, nutrition, kind of ties back into stress levels, But depending on how hard a buck's rut was, mixed with a harsh winter, means that buck is going to be lacking on their nutrition and extremely hungry, which makes them stressed out and causes them to shed early. If they are healthy and they have proper nutrition, then they will shed at a normal, typical time frame. Unless they have an injury, of course, which is the next factor we'll touch on. If they are injured pretty good, like a broken leg or a jaw and so on, this is obviously going to be a huge stressor on them as well. And especially if their injury affects their nutrition, and like it affects if they could eat right. Like if they have an injury to their jaw and they can't eat proper food, then that's even worse. But their body will focus more on the injury than antlers, and this will affect when they will shed, and this actually affects the growing process for the year after. Hence why a deer that has a broken back right leg, normally always the buck's right antler will be all weird and abnormal or smaller, because their body will take nutrients that would go to the antlers normally during the growing process and expend them to the injury, and it basically messes up the opposite antler of whatever side the injury on. So if they have a broken back left leg throughout the growing process, then their right antler during that growing process is going to be jacked up and all different. That's why a lot of times they will get a drop time or get a split off their G2 or just get all funky right antler or left antler depending on the injury. And it all goes back to the stress factor. Again, if they have an injury that affects how they eat, or it affects, let's say they have the broken leg again and they have a harsh winter mixed in, then they are going to be expending a lot of energy to even try and move around the woods. And depending on the injury, it may just really hurt them to even move or walk. So they're basically on the way out and ready to die because just every factor is against them at that point, if they're at that point. But everything goes back to stress, whether it's predation or a harsh winter to where it's hard for them to find food. There's not a lot of food. There's an overpopulation of deer, which makes the food sparse. It all depends on where they live in each scenario and each different piece of woods, because each herd of deer is different. And the last variable I want to touch on, which is often looked over, is the late or prolonged rut. And this is due to their testosterone levels. If there's an unhealthy doe herd with not a lot of healthy mature does, like not a healthy population of does there, then there are young or yearling doe going into heat later in the season. Then the bucks in the area will have a prolonged testosterone level later into the season. So if their testosterone levels don't drop till late season, then they won't lose their sheds till later on. That's why a lot of times when I'm out shed hunting and it's like mid-March and there's still a herd of deer in one area of woods that haven't shed yet, but most of the population around the areas that I shed hunt have dropped, maybe that specific piece of woods has an unhealthy doe population. Maybe there's 1 or 2 or 3 mature does and the rest are all yearling does or fawns that maybe went into heat very late into the season. When I say very late, maybe late December, early January, while most of the bucks are done rutting in like mid-November. Them bucks that their testosterone levels drop in like late November, they're going to shed at probably the typical time frame if every other factor lines up with it. If their nutrition is good, they're not high stressed, and their testosterone levels dropped way back in mid-November. Compared to these bucks that have a prolonged rut, that testosterone levels stay high throughout November, December, maybe into even January. So that's going to be like a month and a half difference of testosterone levels amongst these deer. And that's why some of these bucks will shed often much later than other bucks. And there's also things on injuries to where some bucks may not even shed their antlers if they get castrated during the season, whether they jump over a fence and their balls get caught on the fence and it just gets ripped off, or they get damaged gonads, then their sheds might not fall off because their testosterone's gone. They lost their balls. So I have seen this before as well, to where this one buck basically kept his velvet on till late December. He kept his velvet on. Then he finally shedded his velvet, and then within that same month of him shedding his velvet, he lost his antlers. But I think that was a different scenario because he really just kept his velvet on much longer and he still shedded, but he had some messed up pedicles. His where it connected to the actual skull of the deer, they were like rounded out in the antlers where there's supposed to be a nice base on that antler. So that was a weird scenario there. But I've seen bucks hold all the way through April. Like, I'm trout fishing up in New Jersey and there's a buck running past me still holding antlers while I've just been shed hunting for the past 2 months. So it all depends on each deer herd, each specific deer, and that's why you get things like antlered doe. The nature is crazy and each stuff can happen at crazy times. And there's also a theory that big bucks will shed earlier than smaller bucks. Some people have put out the theory that because of their antlers are heavier and they'll just fall off easier, but it all goes back to testosterone. On when their testosterone drops, maybe that deer has rutted longer because he's a more dominant buck. All right, he just went through a very hard rut because he's the most mature buck and he's been rutting the most. He's been trying to get as much tail as he could possibly can get. He's been neglecting his nutrition. And maybe all of them go into him shedding early because his body cannot focus on its antlers. He needs to focus on getting healthy, and then he starts focusing back on food and everything else. So I believe that the mature bucks will rut harder than most of the younger bucks just because they're more mature and they have more of a dominance factor in the herd. That way, when they're done rutting, then they will shed earlier. I don't think it's so much as their antlers are bigger and they're heavier and they fall off. And then sometimes you get spikes that hold all the way through April as well, just because maybe they're just a younger deer. Their testosterone level never really spiked that much, or they didn't really drop that much because it's such a young deer. Or maybe the mature buck got his rutting out of the way, and then like a yearling doe goes into heat, and then that spike will go into rut mode late in December, and then that's why he holds later on in the year. It all depends on each specific deer herd and each specific deer again. And if their testosterone levels don't drop until late season, then they won't lose their sheds till later on. So there are a bunch of variables that go into when they actually drop their sheds, but it comes down to stress levels, testosterone levels, and injuries. But can you actually have an educated guess on when they will shed? In my opinion, probably not. The only real way to tell when a specific buck sheds or most of the deer shed in your area is to have trail cameras out for real-time intel, or to check on the deer herd on the daily and see when their sheds drop. I used to do this all the time before I had cell cams, and even when I just had normal trail cameras, I would go out into the woods and just pop in on them, like on the daily or every other day or twice a week. Whenever I had time to go into the woods, I would check on the deer herd to see when the bucks actually started shedding. So I just go in there, and once I located the deer herd or a specific buck that I wanted to know if he shed it or not, I'd put my binos up, literally just look at him through the binos and go, okay, he's still got both sides. I'm going to come back maybe 2 days from now and look at him. And then maybe I come back 2 days later and he has one antler. And then I have to roll the dice if I want to go in there and spook him while he just lost one antler to try and find the one, or do I leave him there to let him shed his other antler and then just look for both of them. So there's a bunch of things that you can actually do. Whether you have cell trail cameras or normal trail cameras, or if you just want to pop in on them every now and then, every 2 days, 3 days, just to see if they actually shed. If you have cell cameras, you can just go about your daily life and put that trail camera on a heavy trail or a bait area, and then you will know, okay, there's 2 bucks that have shedded. The big buck is still holding, but there's 2 bucks that shed. Do I want to go in? Do I want to wait? And then it's like, okay, all the bucks shed in the area. Time to go out there and really just hammer the woods and look for the sheds. I know that the deer has shed. And a lot of times deer have significant features to each individual deer. So whether they have a scar or a different white patch on their neck or face, or a hump in their back or a scratch in the back, or whatever it may be, trying to identify your deer away from the antlers, whether it's a scar or a limp or whatever it may be. That way you can know once the deer actually sheds on your trail camera, or if you see him in person, you can go, okay, that's the 8-pointer that I've been watching all year. He's shed. I can see the scar on his right side. It's the same exact deer. And then you can go out there and actually just go look for his sheds and then be productive doing it, being that you know that the sheds have fallen off the deer. There's nothing worse than going out there and you're out there for like 2 hours, and then you locate the deer herd and you put your binos up and you're like, well, all of these deer are still holding. I just wasted 2 hours. So just make sure your intel is correct. Make sure the deer have actually shed before you go out there. And that's basically it, guys. Back to the pedicle. Once they shed, you will normally find blood on the pedicle, and if you see the deer, there will be blood in the pedicle. That means it's a fresh antler if you find a shed with blood all over the pedicle. But that's basically the reasons why they shed. Testosterone levels drop, and depending on injuries or stress levels, that goes into the timing of when they drop. So I really don't think you can realistically time them perfectly on when they're going to shed. The best way to do it is just monitor the deer herd and see when they actually shed. That is really it, guys. I hope this podcast taught you something valuable. I hope you share this video with someone that you think needs to hear this information, and maybe this will help you find more sheds, or maybe it just taught you something new that you did not know today. And again, if you guys want to become a better hunter, a better fisherman, or just a better outdoorsman in general, or if you just want to be watching the same content of the stuff that you do, whether you're a fisherman, a shed hunter, a turkey hunter, a bear hunter, a pheasant hunter, a bass fisherman, a striper fisherman, whatever it may be, fluke fisherman, perch, crappie, whatever it may be. If you do any of these things and you just want to watch some nice content coming out of local boys like yourself or local women, whatever it may be, please hit the follow button. Please subscribe to us. We are on every social media platform: Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and you can find the video version of this podcast on YouTube and the audio alone format on the listening platforms, obviously. So that is it, guys. We have a bunch of interesting stuff coming for 2022, and I hope you guys stick around and just follow us and share this with whoever you may think that needs to hear this. I am Mike with Obviously Outdoorsman. Until tomorrow, to First Light Talk number 39. I hope you guys have a great day and hit the gym and stay healthy and just do something productive with yourselves. I am Mike with Obviously Outdoorsman. Peace, guys.